think it varied quite wildly over time and in different geographical regions, how powerful and how depraved the warlords were. I've heard some historians say that if you were just a normal peasant, the warlord wars might not have touched you at all.
Okay.
But to other people in other places, it completely ruined. I mean, it came through like a whirlwind, so it did depend. So when the Manchu Empire finally fell, the person that really came to the fore was Sun Yat-sen. You might have heard of him. So he's a really important figure for Chinese history. He's sort of a little bit of a George Washington type figure, maybe. Well, founded the Republic, if you like. And he had some not bad ideas. He wasn't like an insane radical. He wanted Chinese nationalism, democracy, and like freedom from foreign invasions and the foreign concessions and stuff, which isn't all that bad. But he died kind of unexpectedly in like 1925, and that sort of threw things into a bit more chaos than they already were. And that really his death really did usher in the warlord wars in China.
Okay.
And the guy that sort of emerged after him as the overall leader was Chiang Kai-shek. And he seems to have been quite a badass, it seems. You know, he's prepared to just throw caution to the wind and stake everything on battles and things like that. He was a warlord himself. He went through a thing called the Northern Expedition, where he sort of took on and kind of conquered or bested one way or another a lot of the warlords in the north. And anyway, over many years, eventually he was sort of his government, they used their Nanjing as the capital, was recognised by most foreign nations as sort of the legitimate, lawful government of China, although they never really had complete control over all of China. I mean, that's a really difficult thing to do.
His capital was Nanjing.
Yeah. So while all that is going on throughout sort of the period of the First World War, and Mao is still just trying to find what to do in life. He, 1913, at the age of 19, he enters a teacher's training college type place, where because it's sort of post-revolution, China's experiencing one of its most open periods ever, and he's allowed to just have access to all sorts of intellectual thought. And as I mentioned earlier, he's a sort of a bit of a confused Republican. He's certainly not a Marxist. They think that it's around this time that he was first ever exposed to sort of socialist thought, but he doesn't seem to have. Well, he definitely didn't take it on board and, you know, become a convert or anything.
He was meeting radicals.
Not really. Oh yeah, some student ones that were like Republicans.
He was hearing about radicalism a lot.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, well, definitely. Yeah, it was a radical time, relatively speaking. In this period, he reads loads, spends lots and lots of time in the library. There's a phrase that was used later in the communist period: "Let 100 flowers bloom." But of course, you were never given anywhere near as much freedom under the communists as Mao was able to enjoy at this sort of crucial period of his relatively young life. But him and his friends sort of poured scorn on China. They'd had like a century of humiliation. Well, they were still in the so-called century of humiliation. They'd been just bested again and again and again by all the foreign powers. Apparently among sort of Chinese intellectuals, or certainly younger ones, they would pour scorn on China. Mao's quoted as saying in this period, quote, "The nature of the people of the country is inertia. They worship hypocrisy, are content with being slaves and narrow-minded," end quote. And apparently that wasn't uncommon. That was just par for the course, that sort of idea. And that they sort of needed to do better in a sort of a grand sense. He went further. There's one anecdote where him and some friends, again from this period when he's about 19 or 20 years old, just had a day trip to a monastery, a picturesque monastery high in the hills. And there they sort of talked late into the night, and one of his friends in a diary or something later recounted that Mao just went further in the radical thoughts than anyone else, sort of talking about burning books, mass burning of books and things.
So he's already one of those people, you know.
Yeah. There's a quote from Yung Chang, quote, "This is the first known occasion when Mao mentioned one theme that was to typify his rule, the destruction of Chinese culture. When he first said it in that moonlit monastery, it had not sounded totally outlandish. At the time of unprecedented personal and intellectual freedom, the freest moment in Chinese history, everything that had been taken for granted was questioned, and what had been viewed as wrong proclaimed as right. Should there be countries, families, marriage, private property? Nothing was too outrageous, too shocking or unsayable." End quote. So I mentioned earlier there was this thing that like the world had been turned upside down when the emperors were finally deposed. Yeah, it's hard to sort of overstate that.
And it's really familiar hearing that about him as well. Like, a lot of people go through that, especially when they go to university or when they first go to cities or when they first stay in cities. Like, students now, even though we're used to like suburban life already, even so, when we go to unis, it's like a ferment of radicalism and question everything sort of attitudes.
Yeah. And imagine having that coinciding with an actual
revolution had happened. And World War One had happened.
It was just about to happen or is beginning, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And apparently it was about this time that, or around these years, the next sort of 5 years or so, that Mao's thinking sort of formed in any real way, or almost completely, in fact. A lot of what he wrote in essays and articles and things, or actually he just continued to believe those things for the rest of his life.
Like, the people he was with would have all been nationalists in the sense of they wanted to throw off the colonial yoke, right?
Yeah.
So, were they part of a movement that thought of itself as nationalist?
At this stage, I would have thought so, yeah, I believe so, yeah. Because this is really early. I mean, so the actual Chinese Communist Party isn't formed until 1920. Of course, the Bolsheviks haven't got in until 1917, so this is still before that. Right. And as I say, Mao isn't a socialist or a communist at all.
Yeah. He's
just a student. So this period, around sort of 1917, 1918, well, there's another quote from Chiang. Quote, "It was in this environment that Mao's views on morals took shape. In the winter of 1917 to 1918, still a student as he turned 24, he wrote extensive commentaries on a book called A System of Ethics by a minor late 19th century German philosopher, Friedrich Paulsen. In these notes, Mao expressed the central elements of his own character, which stayed consistent for the remaining 6 decades of his life, and defined his rule. Mao's attitudes towards morality consisted of one core, the self, I, above everything else." This is Mao writing now. "I do not agree with the view that to be moral, the motives of one's action has to be benefiting others. Morality does not have to be defined in relation to others. People like me want to satisfy our hearts to the full, and in doing so, we automatically have the most valuable moral codes. Of course, there are people and objects in the world, but they are all there only for me." End quote. Yeah, so anyway, according to actual Chinese historians, that he believed that throughout his entire life. Would you say a sociopath or even psychopathic type ideas?
It fits with what I know of those things, yeah.
I mean, I remember thinking things as insane as that when I was about 15 or 16, but also at the same time knowing it was comically insane.
And knowing that you'd probably grow out of it or move on to something else.
Yeah. Or something in real life, in reality, would just stomp that sort of bullshit out of you. Yeah. And you'd learn to just sort of deal with the real world.
Or you'll hold, when you're young, sometimes you can hold that idea and a contradictory one, not at the same moment, but in the same day. Like.
Yeah. But he wrote that shit when he was 24 and
it seems like he carried on thinking that way.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
Mixed with, I'm sure you'll come on to this, but mixed with later the idea of social justice.
Sure, later on, a lot later on, but yeah. It's like that, it's like the ideas of Marx were just simply laid over the top of this sort of philosophy. There's more. Chiang writes, quote, Mao shunned all restraints of responsibility and duty. Mao writing again. People like me only have a duty to ourselves. We have no duty to other people. I'm responsible only for the reality that I know, and absolutely not responsible for anything else. I don't know about the past. I don't know about the future. They have nothing to do with the reality of my own self. End quote. But Chiang goes on. He explicitly rejected any responsibility towards future generations. Quote, some say one has a responsibility for history. I don't believe it. I am only concerned about developing myself. I have my desire and act on it. I am responsible to no one. End quote. Mao did not believe in anything unless he could benefit from it personally. Again, Mao. A good name after death cannot bring me any joy, because it belongs to the future and not to my own reality. People like me are not building achievements to leave for future generations. End quote. And all this does ring true for what he goes on to do, doesn't it?
Yeah. Mixed with other things.
Sure.
That should contradict it, but don't.
Chiang says, Mao did not care what he left behind. He argued that conscience could go to hell if it was in conflict with his impulses. Mao again. These two, i.e. impulses and conscience, these two should be one and the same. All our actions are driven by impulse, and a conscience that is wise will go along with this in every instance. Sometimes conscience restrains impulses, such as overeating or overindulgence in sex, but conscience is only there to restrain, not oppose, and the restraint is for better completion of the impulse. As conscience always implies some concern for other people, I do not think these commands, like do not kill, do not steal, and do not slander, have to do with conscience. I think they are only out of self-interest, for self-preservation. All considerations must be purely calculation of oneself, and absolutely not for obeying external ethical codes, or for so-called feelings of responsibility. Chiang finishes, absolute selfishness and irresponsibility lay at the heart of Mao's outlook. It's funny, when I first researched this stuff, I didn't know that stuff in explicit detail like that. I wasn't really surprised, to be honest.
No. No, it all sounds terribly sort of portentous, doesn't it?
But especially that sort of information puts paid to the lie that he had good intentions. I've heard that said, people sort of defending Mao vaguely when you mention that he was horrible.
They will be people who share the idea of social justice, right?
Yeah, but the Marxist communist social justice thing, like I say, is extra to this, what I've just said. It's extra to his philosophy of the self, of I, above everything else. That's not really got anything to do with communism.
No.
So yeah, when I've heard people defend Mao or be an apologist for Chinese communism say, well, Mao had the best intentions of heart. It might have gone terribly wrong, sort of against his wishes, but he meant well. It was meant to help China.
Like Diane Abbott. So.
Yeah, exactly. He did more good than harm.
More good than harm, which is just not true. But.
Well, we'll come to how much that isn't true when we finally get to the Great Leap Forward. But yeah, so to zoom out or away from Mao himself for a while, yeah, while all this is going on, there's World War One, which China wasn't massively involved in itself, but what was important sort of to our story or to the greater story was that obviously Germany was defeated.
Yeah.
And people, mainly Japan, were able to just take the German-held concession states in China.
And Japan were close friends with Britain at this point, by the end of the war, weren't they?
Sort of, yeah. I mean,
or cooperative, like
cooperative,
a good relationship.
Yeah.
And at Versailles, isn't it true that the Germans lost? They had the Shandong province.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to go on to. Yeah.
Right.
Well, everything that they had in China was essentially ceded to Japan,
right? More
or less, and the Chinese themselves were aghast to find that was the case. They thought their sort of new-ish Republican government would do better at Versailles for themselves than that.
And granted to their hated enemies.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
The German concessions were.
Japan, of course, historically, are like their sort of number one enemy, if you like.
And
that didn't go down well.
Apparently that land included the home of, the birthplace of Confucius as well.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Apparently.
That's interesting. Yeah, and the Chinese, without being too cliched about it, do take that sort of thing quite seriously. Metaphorical things like that can spark off not metaphorical, but symbolic things like that can sometimes spark off whole rebellions.
And not only among Confucians or whatever as well, not even only among nationalists, just it will make new nationalists.
Yeah.
Something like that, because it seems like a calculated insult. Or worse.
Yeah.
A calculated attack.
Yeah.
But I presume China at Versailles was powerless to stop any of this.
Yeah, it seems they had very little sway.
Right.
Yeah. Sort of Sun Yat-sen's government wasn't massively strong or consolidated. Like I say, I've heard historians say that the first time China was truly united ever, was in 1949 when the communists finally win.
Right.
And there's stages before that when they sort of become a bit more united under Chiang Kai-shek, but under Sun Yat-sen, still kind of fractious and just didn't have the weight at Versailles to get what they wanted very much.
Couldn't get in the room for the important discussion.
Probably, yeah.
There was only and most things were really being sorted out among 3 men, not even the big 4, right? Sometimes 2.
What
was Lloyd George and Clemenceau?
Lloyd George. Well, no, Wilson sort of.
When Wilson was there,
I thought it was mainly the big 3. Yeah, mainly
and
decided
Italy
everything.
was in all the pictures, but we're just getting told.
I mean, I know that Wilson went there with sort of grand plans for everything and sort of got a lot of what he wanted through, but not everything.
Well, if you read Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace, he says that he found Wilson really unimpressive. He said that Wilson and his main man his main man was more informed than he was, but he said Wilson seemed not to be informed on what really mattered. Like, it wasn't well informed on the things that he needed to know to get good results at Versailles.
Huh, interesting.
That's what Keynes says.
I can believe so. I've heard Wilson at Versailles described as, he was basically an academic, like a professor type, and he just had all these sort of blue sky thinking ideas. Wasn't necessarily all that married to the real world. But I suppose there's worse things you could go into it with, but...
Had a lot of book learning. He was the first PhD president, wasn't he?
The first... Oh, really? Is that true?
Yeah, he was the first president who had a PhD.
But Mao did have some funny ideas about things, like specific ideas. On heroes, the idea of great heroes throughout history, and he considered himself, even when he was in his 20s, to be one of them. He wrote, quote, "Everything outside their nature, i.e. great heroes of history, such as restrictions and constraints, must be swept away by the great strength in their nature. When great heroes give full play to their impulses, they are magnificently powerful, stormy and invincible. Their power is like a hurricane arising from a deep gorge, and, like a sex maniac on heat, prowling for a lover, there is no way to stop them." End quote.
And he's partly referring to himself when he says these things, right?
Yeah, he puts himself...
What he is and what he wants to be.
Yeah, yeah.
You can well see that coming through later.
Yeah.
Grandiose, pompous sense of superiority.
Absolutely, yeah, hugely.
And so even at that time, he was like something of a nobody at this point, right? I mean... Yeah,
no, absolutely, really, a nobody.
Just
quite an old student, yeah. 24-year-old student who hadn't really done anything.
So I just wonder why he had such big ideas about himself already. Like, was he just good at bullying people? Was he good at, like, just bullying a room intellectually and personality?
I'm not sure. One of the things I've read is that some of his teachers and friends say that he was quite a personality, but others teachers say that he didn't show any leadership skills.
He keeps referencing sex. Like, I mean, was he like? Did he see himself as having conquered loads of fine women?
Earlier on in his life, it was fairly normal sex life. Like he has his second marriage in a few years' time after the period I'm talking about here, and he seems relatively normal in the sphere of sex. But when he gets older and he's supremely powerful, he goes a bit off the rails. I mean, I'll get into that in detail then. But yeah, I mean, he ends up as a bit of a sex fiend with like a massive harem.
Because it sounds like maybe he, back in his village, was probably denied hardly any sexual opportunities. But like when you go to the city, suddenly you're meeting loads of students and stuff.
Maybe.
And you're among, thousands of people.
Maybe. Remember, he was married off when he was really young, like 14 or 15 or something, wasn't it?
And then she died quite
And
quickly.
she died, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think he's pretty much normal sex-wise, but until he becomes powerful, and then, yeah, he just has a room where there's women there.
Yeah, lined up.
Yeah. Like, he literally throws a party, massive party in like a huge ballroom type, and then there's a room next to it where pretty much only he goes in, and there's just tons of women in there, and he, in air quotes, relaxes in there.
Yeah. It's all for him. Everything's for him. It's all on the way he thinks it should be.
Although this isn't much of a redeeming feature, it seems like he was not into anything crazy. Like, he just liked women, sort of straightforward sex with women, and that was it. It wasn't like truly deviant or anything.
No, I don't imagine that. And when he was like supreme ruler, like obviously he just had women arranged for him, right? Just have women brought to him.
Yeah, that's right.
They were probably compelled, a lot of them, right?
Maybe not. Because there's the cult of Mao. I mean, obviously it was physically disgusting.
Yeah.
But lots of women actually don't seem to care too much about that if they're infatuated with you.
No, I've seen
I mean,
rich ugly men, and they're surrounded by women.
Yeah. Chiang again, quote, "The other central element in his character, which Mao spelt out now, was the joy he took in upheaval and destruction." Mao writes, quote, "Giant wars will last as long as heaven and earth and will never become extinct. The idea of a world with great equality and harmony is mistaken." End quote. About that, Chiang writes, quote, "This is not just a prediction that a pessimist might make. It was Mao's desideratum, which he asserted was what the population at large wished." Mao writes, quote, "Long-lasting peace is unendurable to human beings, and tidal waves of disturbance have to be created in this state of peace. When we look at history, we adore the times of war, when dramas happen one after the other, which make reading about them great fun. When we get to the periods of peace and prosperity, we are bored. Human nature loves sudden, swift changes." End quote. And on that, Chiang writes, "Mao simply collapsed the distinction between reading about stirring events and actually living through cataclysm. He ignored the fact that, for the overwhelming majority, war meant misery." End quote.
Sounds like the young Marx, like the will, the keenness to destroy and smash what has come before.
Almost for the sake of it.
Because it all seems wrong, I guess. Because it all seems unjust.
Or maybe because you love it. Like I say, that's a bit of a communist thing. Well, obviously, if you're talking about Marx, but just that idea. Yeah. It seems Mao just had the idea for the sake of it, though.
Because peace was boring.
Well, because he wrote that, what I just quoted, before he was a socialist. So.
Yeah.
Mao's fondness for an endless supply of young women, chosen for him wherever he goes, and his refusal to bathe disgust Li.
"I was nauseated. Mao's sexual indulgences, his sullying of so many naive and innocent young women, were almost more than I could bear."
Mao becomes a carrier of venereal disease that refuses Li's suggested treatment and his plea for him to improve his personal hygiene, saying, "I wash myself in the bodies of my young women."
Yes!